A waiter refuses to serve a black woman, unaware that she is the owner of the restaurant. But the situation takes an unexpected turn when the woman's son steps in and reveals her true identity, leaving the waiter stunned. It was a bustling afternoon in the cozy, yet refined bistro, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling garlic wafting through the air. The sound of clinking glasses and the murmur of polite conversation filled the warm atmosphere. The restaurant's wooden floors creaked with every step, and the dim lights created an intimate, almost nostalgic ambience. Yet, in the midst of this cozy setting, there was a silent tension building. The eyes of the waiter, a young man in his mid-20s, narrowed with a barely concealed disgust as he approached her table. She sat alone, her skin a deep and beautiful shade of brown, her hair perfectly styled in natural curls. Her posture was dignified, her gaze focused on the menu in front of her. Despite her outward calm, there was a storm brewing inside her. For months now, she had been subjected to this kind of treatment, rejection, humiliation, and scorn. The waiter, without a word, slid a glass of water onto the table, his hand brushing against it with a sense of reluctance. He didn't meet her eyes, and his lips barely moved when he spoke. "What would you like to order?" he asked coldly, as if her presence wasn't worth acknowledging. Her heart clenched. The dismissive tone was all too familiar. She had been in this place many times before, not here, in this bistro, but in life. She had been rejected by the world in ways too painful to recount. Her soul had been weathered by years of betrayal, abandonment, and humiliation. "Can I please have the seafood pasta?" she replied, her voice steady but the pain of countless rejections seeping into her words. The waiter didn't respond. Instead, he nodded curtly and turned away, making no effort to engage further. She could feel his gaze on her as he walked back to the kitchen, his eyes full of judgment, as if she were unworthy of the meal she had just ordered. But it wasn't just this one moment. It was every moment. The job she worked tirelessly to build from nothing, the respect she fought for, the constant need to prove herself. All of it, rejected, ignored, and belittled. Her skin, so dark and rich, seemed to mark her as different in every space she entered, and no matter how much she accomplished, the world always saw her as less than. She thought of all the times she had been turned away from opportunities, treated as invisible or unworthy. How many times had her ideas been dismissed simply because of her race? How many times had she been forced to shrink herself just to fit in? How many times had she worked twice as hard just to be considered half as good? The weight of those thoughts sat heavily on her chest, each breath a painful reminder of the unfairness she had endured. But there was more. Much more. She was a mother, too. A single mother to a young man who adored her more than anything in this world. Her son, the only reason she kept pushing forward even when it felt impossible. He was the light in her life, the reason she woke up every morning, even when the world seemed set on dragging her down. It was in this context that the waiter, the one who could not see her beyond the color of her skin, approached her once more. His voice was even colder now. "Your order will be up soon," he said dismissively, his eyes avoiding hers at all costs. She tried not to let the sting of his words pierce her heart, but it was impossible not to feel the sharpness of his disdain. She had seen it too many times to ignore it now. But just as she prepared to retreat into herself, a small voice interrupted the tension. "Mom, don't worry. I'll take care of this." Her son, no older than 10, had emerged from the back of the restaurant, his little legs carrying him with purpose. He wasn't just a boy, he was the reason she had fought so hard to make something of herself. The waiter looked at him, confused. "What do you mean, son? Mom's the owner here." "She doesn't need your attitude," he said firmly, his eyes widening as he realized the truth. The waiter's face fell. The smug expression he had worn when he first approached her evaporated in an instant. The recognition that she was, in fact, the owner of the bistro, and not just some random patron, hit him like a slap in the face. His cheeks flushed with embarrassment, his mouth opening and closing in an attempt to form an apology. But no words came. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The silent power she had always held, the quiet strength forged by years of struggle, spoke louder than any words could. She had been rejected, humiliated, and abandoned so many times that she had learned how to hold her ground without saying a word. Her son stepped closer to her, taking her hand with a tender grip. And in that moment, she realized something crucial. All those years of pain and rejection had shaped her into something stronger, something unbreakable. But as the waiter stammered, trying to apologize, she felt no need for his words. He had no power over her anymore. Her son's voice was the only thing that could still make her feel alive in moments like this, when the world tried to drown her in its judgment. She looked down at him, her heart swelling with love and pride, but also with an ache that never quite left. The pain of being overlooked, ignored, and sometimes despised for simply existing in her skin had been a part of her life for as long as she could remember. It was a constant companion, always lurking, always present. Her journey had not been an easy one. Raised in a small, poverty-stricken neighborhood, she had learned early on that life was rarely fair for people like her. As a little girl, she watched as her father worked multiple jobs just to provide for their family, but the world was unforgiving. Despite his tireless efforts, they always seemed to be just one step away from slipping into despair. It wasn't just the financial strain that weighed heavily on her shoulders, it was the constant microaggressions, the subtle but cutting remarks about her skin, the way people looked at her like she didn't belong. Her mother had passed away when she was just a teenager, and in her absence, she became the caretaker of her younger siblings. She grew up fast, too fast, and learned to put aside her own dreams to take care of everyone else. There was never any time for her. She would never forget the feeling of being invisible, how the world seemed to see her, not for her talents or her intelligence, but for her race. She had to work twice as hard to prove her worth, and even then, there were people who would dismiss her with a wave of their hand. When she finally left home and moved to the city, she thought things would be different. But the prejudice followed her, and it came from all corners. She was passed over for promotions, given less respect than her colleagues, and all the while, her hard work seemed to go unnoticed. But she was stubborn. She wasn't going to let the world break her. She started with small businesses, learning the ins and outs of the restaurant industry, taking on menial jobs that barely paid enough to survive. But she dreamed big. She dreamed of owning her own restaurant one day, a place where she could prove her worth, where people would finally see her as something more than just her skin. She sacrificed everything, friendships, comfort, sleep, to make it happen. Her hands were calloused from working long hours, her eyes always tired from lack of rest, but she knew that if she gave up now, she would lose everything. She saved every penny, worked herself into the ground, and finally, after years of struggle, she opened her own bistro. It wasn't much at first, just a small, intimate space with rustic tables and a menu of carefully crafted dishes that reflected her heritage. But it was hers. Every inch of the place had her fingerprints on it. Every plate, every ingredient, every moment, she had worked for it all. She had hoped that, as the owner, the judgment would stop. That people would see her as a successful businesswoman, someone to be respected. But the truth was, the world didn't change just because she owned a restaurant. It was the same. People still looked at her with skepticism, still whispered behind her back, still refused to believe that someone like her could succeed. And now, standing in her own restaurant, she felt the same sting, the waiter's cold dismissal, his refusal to see her for who she was, still hurt. As her son stood by her side, his hand gripping hers tightly, she realized something that made her heart ache even more deeply. She had built this all on her own, but she had never truly felt seen. It was the same old cycle. She fought so hard to prove herself, but at the end of the day, she was still invisible to those who refused to see past her skin. The waiter, still standing awkwardly by the kitchen, now seemed to realize the enormity of his mistake. His face flushed red as he tried to speak, but the words came out stammering and unsure. I didn't know. I'm so sorry, he muttered, his eyes flicking from her to her son and then back down to the floor. She didn't move. She wasn't angry, not exactly. She was tired. So tired of fighting, tired of being made to feel small, tired of constantly having to prove herself. She looked at him with a calmness that was almost unsettling, and for a moment, it seemed like time stood still. There were so many things she could say to him, the hurt she felt, the injustices she had endured, the years of humiliation. But she didn't want to waste her breath. She had already said everything in her silence, in the way she carried herself, in the strength she exuded without uttering a single word. "Thank you for your apology," she said softly, her voice carrying an undertone of finality. "But your mistake doesn't change anything." The waiter didn't know how to respond. He had thought his job was just to serve food, but now, in the face of the woman he had dismissed so easily, he realized it was never just about food. It was about respect, about understanding, and about seeing the humanity in everyone, no matter their skin color. As the bistro buzzed with the usual sounds of the lunch crowd, a strange stillness enveloped their corner of the room. The waiter, standing motionless, finally took a step back, retreating to the kitchen without another word. Her son looked up at her with a mixture of concern and pride. "Are you okay, Mom?" She nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm more than okay, baby. I'm exactly where I need to be." She wasn't sure if she truly believed that, but she had said it for him. She had said it because he needed to hear it. She had spent so many years fighting for a place in this world, and now, more than ever, she realized that no one could take that away from her. She had her own story, a story of pain, rejection, and relentless perseverance. But that was in the past now. As the day wore on, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Yes, there had been betrayal, there had been abandonment, but there had also been resilience, strength, and a deep, undying love for her son. No longer was she defined by the judgments of others. Her worth was hers to define. And no one, not even the waiter who had failed to see her humanity, could take that from her. As the waiter disappeared into the back, her son took her hand, leading her to a quieter corner of the bistro, where they could find some space away from the rush of customers. It was a strange moment. A calm after the storm, yet the storm never truly left her heart. The anger that should have filled her chest had settled into a heavy sadness. Not because of the waiter, his shame, though palpable, was irrelevant. She had long stopped caring for the validation of people like him. No, it was the recognition that the world would never let her forget the weight of her skin. Even now, sitting in her own restaurant, in the place she had fought so hard to build, she could still feel the sting of all the years of being dismissed. The truth was, the waiter's behavior was not an isolated incident. She had faced these types of microaggressions every single day. In business meetings, at parties, in the grocery store, people would either look past her or treat her like she was invisible, as if her success was something they couldn't allow themselves to acknowledge. Her mind drifted back to the early days, when she was just starting her bistro. The first months were grueling. There was a constant battle against both the financial pressures of running a business and the social expectations placed on her as a black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated industry. Many people simply didn't believe in her. She often overheard whispers from other business owners who doubted her abilities, questioning how someone like her could make it. How someone who didn't look the part could possibly be successful in a place like this. Her friends had tried to offer encouragement, but she could see the doubt in their eyes as well. Some of them were uncomfortable with the idea that she was trying to break into spaces where she wasn't welcomed. Some didn't understand why she kept pushing when it seemed like the odds were always stacked against her. It wasn't just the professional world that rejected her, it was society itself. The bitterness of being labeled other never seemed to fade. She couldn't walk into a room without someone assuming she didn't belong there. She couldn't speak without people questioning her expertise, her intelligence, her worth. Every day, it felt like she was forced to prove herself in ways that others never had to. But she did it. She fought back against every judgment, every narrow-minded look, every closed door. She worked tirelessly to build a place where she could exist on her terms, a place where people would eventually come to appreciate her not because of who they thought she was, but because of what she created. And now, she was watching that very creation be devalued in front of her. Her thoughts were interrupted by her son's voice, soft but steady. "Mom, I don't think you should let him get to you. You've worked so hard for this." Her son had always been her biggest supporter, and in moments like this, she needed his strength. She smiled down at him, pushing the weight of her emotions aside for just a moment to focus on him. "I know, baby," she said quietly, her hand squeezing his. Sometimes it feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough. People always want to put me in a box, to make me small. But I won't let them do that." Her son nodded, his eyes full of understanding. He had witnessed her struggle, her pain, but he had also seen her triumphs. He saw her as the strong, resilient woman she was, the one who had built something from nothing. The woman who had refused to let rejection define her. He knew she was more than what anyone could say or think of her. Before she could say anything else, the waiter returned. He approached her slowly, almost timidly, with his head lowered in an apology. I didn't mean to offend you earlier," he said, his voice faltering. "I was out of line. I'm really sorry. It was just... I've never seen you before, and I didn't know." She could hear the sincerity in his voice, but the words didn't change anything. He had already made his judgment. He had already assumed she wasn't worthy of the service she came to receive. And in doing so, he had unknowingly reminded her of every time she had been treated as less than. The world always seemed to want to remind her of her place, even when she had earned a place of her own. "I appreciate your apology," she said, her voice measured and calm. "But I don't need it. I need you to understand something. My worth isn't tied to your approval. It never was." The waiter stood there for a moment, looking almost unsure of how to respond. His eyes flicked to her son, then back to her. He seemed to realize that what had just transpired wasn't about him, but about something much bigger. His discomfort was palpable, but this wasn't her burden to carry. She had carried enough for a lifetime. She didn't offer him further words. The conversation, though seemingly resolved, still felt unfinished. There was no closure for her in his apology. What had been taken could not be undone by a few words. Her silence now was not one of anger, but of finality. It was a lesson for him, and for herself. Her son squeezed her hand again, this time with more confidence than before. He had witnessed the entire exchange, and in his young eyes, he saw the strength of a mother who refused to be silenced by anyone. The waitress returned to his post, awkwardly, but something had shifted. The tension in the air had thickened, and yet, it had also broken. For her, this was no longer about confronting an individual, nor about claiming a space that had always been hers. It was about asserting the truth of her existence. She had built this bistro, her dream, with blood, sweat, and tears. This was her story, one that no one, not even the waiter, could rewrite. The doors of the bistro swung open with the rush of a new wave of customers, and the world outside continued, blissfully unaware of what had just transpired. She, however, was no longer the same woman who had walked into that room, rejected and unseen. She had always known her worth. And that was all that mattered. The rest of the day passed in a strange kind of quiet. The usual hum of the bistro, the chime of the doorbell as customers entered, the clinking of silverware, all of it felt distant, as if it was happening in another world. She sat at her table in the corner, her son by her side, watching the customers come and go, but her mind was far away. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of frustration, exhaustion, and, oddly enough, a sense of calm. The incident with the waiter had reopened old wounds, but it had also made her realize something essential. She was tired of trying to prove her worth to people who weren't willing to see it. In a way, this small moment of rejection had forced her to confront the truth. She had spent so many years seeking validation from others that she had forgotten the one truth that mattered most: her own value was not up for negotiation. Her success, her journey, her accomplishments, they were hers and hers alone. No amount of prejudice could ever change that. But even as she sat there, a part of her couldn't shake the bitterness. She had fought so hard to get to this point, only to be treated like an outsider in her own space. She had built this restaurant with her bare hands. Every tile on the floor, every chair in place, every recipe perfected, it was all a testament to her resilience. And yet, in this moment, she was still seen as other, as less than. The waiter's refusal to serve her was just another reminder that the world was not a place that easily accepted her. Her son, sensing the weight of her thoughts, spoke up quietly. "Mom, you're amazing. People don't see it yet, but they will. You've already made it. Look at everything you've built. Look at me. You've shown me how strong you are every single day." Her heart swelled with pride, and for the first time that day, a smile tugged at her lips. "I know, baby. But sometimes, it's hard. It's hard to keep fighting when it feels like the world is telling you don't belong." He nodded, understanding more than she sometimes gave him credit for. "I know it's tough, but you taught me that being who we are is enough. We don't need to prove anything to anyone." Her son's words had a profound effect on her. He was right. She had spent so much of her life fighting against the world's perception of her that she had forgotten to appreciate the journey itself. She had made it. She had already proven herself, not to the waiter, not to the people who doubted her, but to herself. The restaurant started to fill up again as the evening approached, and the quiet tension that had hung in the air since the incident began to fade. The waiter, still visibly uncomfortable, continued his duties, avoiding eye contact with her but going through the motions as if nothing had happened. She could see his unease. He knew he had messed up, but part of her wasn't sure if he even truly understood why. She didn't want an apology from him anymore. She didn't need it. What she needed was respect, not just from him, but from the world around her. But in her heart, she also knew that respect wouldn't come from others. It had to come from within herself first. The evening wore on, and she continued to sit with her son, watching the ebb and flow of the restaurant. She didn't want to be consumed by the incident, so she focused on the things that mattered. The laughter of her loyal customers, the familiar hum of the kitchen, the feeling of her hands gently stroking the table as she took in the ambience of her own creation. But there was something nagging at the back of her mind. Something she couldn't shake. Later in the evening, when the dinner rush had slowed and the last of the customers had left, she stood behind the bar, wiping down the counter. The waiter, now more relaxed but still hesitant, walked over to her. "Do you mind if I talk to you for a minute?" he asked cautiously. She stopped what she was doing and turned to him. His expression was serious, and he seemed like he wanted to make amends. "I've been thinking about what happened earlier," he began. "And I don't think I realized the gravity of my actions. I've worked in this industry for a while, but I've never had to confront something like this. I thought I was just doing my job, but I was wrong. I didn't see you for who you were. And I'm sorry." She met his gaze, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself to see him as a person, someone who had made a mistake, yes, but also someone who had the capacity to learn from it. "I appreciate that," she said softly, but there was no anger in her voice, only a quiet understanding. "You didn't see me. But the truth is, you're not the only one who's done that. The world does it every day. And I've had to learn how to live with that." The waiter seemed to hesitate, as if unsure how to proceed. "I've been thinking about that too. And I want to make it right," he said. "I don't want to just apologize. I want to learn. I want to be better. I know I'm not the only one who's had these biases. I want to understand where I went wrong." She looked at him, surprised by his sincerity. "You can't change everything overnight," she said. "But you can change the way you see people. And that's where it starts." He nodded, a look of genuine determination in his eyes. "I want to do better. I will." She smiled faintly, knowing that this conversation wouldn't undo everything, but it was a start. As he turned to leave, she couldn't help but feel a small sense of hope. Perhaps things didn't have to stay the way they were. Perhaps change could begin, even in small moments like this one. But just as she was about to turn away, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Her phone buzzed on the counter, an email notification flashing on the screen. She picked it up absent-mindedly, expecting a work-related update. But when she saw the subject line, her heart stopped. "Urgent, restaurant audit results." She opened the email, her hands shaking as she read the words on the screen. The restaurant, her restaurant, had been flagged for a sudden surprise audit. The tax authorities were investigating financial discrepancies that they claimed were linked to her operations. Her stomach dropped. Was this a coincidence? Or had someone tried to sabotage her? But she didn't have time for doubt. Whoever was behind this would soon regret underestimating her. The storm was far from over. The email had hit her like a slap across the face. She stared at the words for a long moment, her mind struggling to grasp what was unfolding before her. Tax discrepancies? An audit? A surprise investigation? This was not just a minor inconvenience, this was a direct threat to everything she had built, everything she had worked so hard to protect. Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the situation sinking deep into her bones. The message was clear: someone wanted to tear down her empire, to dismantle the life she had painstakingly constructed. But who would do such a thing? And why? She sat still for a moment, trying to collect her thoughts. The restaurant was her heart and soul. She had given it everything, every ounce of energy, every late night, every sacrifice. It wasn't just a business, it was a statement. It was proof that she, a black woman, could not only survive but thrive in an industry that had long been designed to exclude her. She hadn't built this place to simply succeed. She had built it to show the world that she belonged, that she could stand tall in spaces that had always been closed to her. And now, it felt as though everything was slipping away. She put the phone down with a heavy sigh, her fingers lingering on the screen for a moment longer than necessary. Her son had noticed her silence and looked at her with concern. He could see the tension in her face, the way her jaw clenched and her eyes seemed far away. "Mom, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice full of worry. She turned to him, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Nothing, baby. Just some business stuff. It's nothing I can't handle." But her son wasn't fooled. He had seen the weight of the world on her shoulders too many times before to be deceived by her calm exterior. "Do you need help?" he asked, his eyes filled with a mix of concern and determination. She shook her head, though she knew he only wanted to protect her. I'll handle it. You focus on school and your dreams. I'll take care of everything. He hesitated but didn't push. He trusted her, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. He knew how hard she fought, how much she sacrificed. And he knew, deep down, that this wasn't just some minor obstacle. Something was wrong. But there was no time to dwell on that now. She needed to figure out what had happened, why the audit was happening, and who could have orchestrated this attack on her business. She had built her empire on transparency and integrity, but there was always the risk that someone would try to bring her down, and she wasn't naive enough to think that jealousy and spite didn't exist in this industry. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the waiter's behavior that afternoon couldn't have been a coincidence. It was as if he had been trying to send a message, a small, subtle reminder that no matter how hard she fought, she would always be seen as less than. And now, with this audit hanging over her, it felt like the universe was confirming what she had always feared. She would always be fighting an uphill battle, and no matter how far she climbed, there would always be someone ready to push her back down. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. This time, it was a message from her accountant, James. He had been working with her for years, helping her navigate the complexities of running a business. She opened the message, her eyes scanning the brief text. I've reviewed the audit notice. This is a targeted attack. It's not random. We need to act fast. I'll call you tomorrow. Stay calm. Her stomach churned. A targeted attack? Who could want to sabotage her like this? She had made enemies along the way, but she had always assumed her enemies were few and far between. She had worked with integrity, and yet, someone was trying to tear it all down. The realization hit her hard. This wasn't just about the waiter or the subtle rejection she had faced. This was bigger. This was someone who wanted to destroy her from the inside out, to expose her vulnerabilities and make her question everything she had worked for. The waiter's refusal to serve her earlier, it was part of something bigger. Maybe he hadn't realized it in the moment, but his actions had been a small piece in a much larger puzzle. The quiet disdain, the microaggressions, the refusal to acknowledge her as the owner, they weren't isolated events. They were symptoms of a deeper issue, a pattern of behavior that had been building for years. And now, with the audit looming, it felt like she was being pushed to the edge. She couldn't let it break her. She wouldn't let it. The world had never been kind to her, but that had never stopped her before. With a deep breath, she stood up from the table, her mind racing with plans, with ideas for how she could fight back. This was just another battle in a long war she had been waging her whole life, and she was ready for it. I'm going to handle this, she said firmly, her voice steady. I won't let anyone take what I've built. Her son looked up at her, his expression one of quiet admiration. I believe in you, Mom. You're unstoppable. She smiled at him, her heart swelling with love for the boy who had watched her endure all the pain and rejection over the years. But as she moved toward the back office to strategize, a thought flashed in her mind. What if the waiter was just the beginning? What if this was part of something larger, something more sinister? Was it possible that someone within her own team was behind the audit, quietly working to destroy her from within? She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. As the last of the evening's patrons filtered out of the restaurant, and the noise of the city began to fade into the background, she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She had faced rejection, betrayal, and humiliation before. She had overcome it all. And she would do it again. But there was one thing she knew for sure: whoever was behind this, whoever was trying to tear her down, they would regret underestimating her. Because this time, she was not going to be silent. She was going to fight with everything she had. The days following the audit notice were filled with tension and uncertainty. She had always been able to handle pressure, but this time, it felt different. She spent hours in her office, going over every detail of her financial records with James, making sure that everything was in order. But no matter how much she dug, the feeling in her gut wouldn't go away. There was something deeper at play here, something she couldn't yet fully see. Her son, sensing the strain, kept his distance but often checked in with her, bringing her coffee or sitting with her in silence. He didn't need to say anything, he knew this was a battle she had to fight on her own. And yet, even in his quiet support, she could feel the strength of his belief in her, something that fueled her resolve. Then, the breakthrough came, not in the form of an email or a phone call, but in a moment of clarity. It was late one evening, after the last of the customers had left and the restaurant was quiet. She was alone, sitting at her desk, her mind running through every possible angle. Her thoughts kept circling back to the waiter, the one who had refused to serve her that day, the one who had sparked everything. She had spent so much time focused on the audit and the possible sabotage, but she hadn't considered the implications of that moment fully. As she thought back to the way he had looked at her, the subtle sneer, the hesitation in his voice when he had told her he couldn't serve her, it struck her that his behavior wasn't just about racism or a lack of awareness. It was personal. He had been dismissive, but there had been something else in his eyes, something she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge until now: fear. Fear. Her heart skipped a beat. She sat up straight in her chair, the pieces suddenly falling into place. The waiter wasn't just refusing to serve her because of prejudice, he was refusing to acknowledge her because he knew exactly who she was, and he feared the consequences of being discovered. In that moment, the truth hit her like a freight train. She had been too focused on the bigger picture to notice the small, telling signs. The waiter hadn't just been disrespectful, he had been trying to protect himself, trying to keep his job, his position safe. She had been so caught up in the idea of sabotage that she hadn't even considered the possibility that the person closest to her, the person who had been working under her roof, could have been trying to undermine her. It all made sense now. The waiter was involved in the plot to undermine her, not just as a bystander but as an active participant. He had known about the audit before it had even reached her, and he had been playing his part by demeaning her publicly, making her seem insignificant in front of her customers. His refusal to serve her had been a carefully calculated move, a move meant to weaken her and make her appear less competent, less authoritative. And the tax audit? That was the final blow. She stood up from her desk, her breath quickening as her mind raced through the possibilities. She had trusted him. He had been a part of her team for months, and now she realized that he had been working against her the whole time. She had let him into her space, into her life, and now it felt as if everything she had built was under threat. But she wouldn't let him win. She wouldn't let him or anyone else take what she had worked so hard for. She walked toward the kitchen, her footsteps firm and purposeful, her mind already set on what she needed to do. She was done with playing nice, done with letting people think they could walk all over her. She was done being the victim. It was time to take control. The waiter was finishing his shift when she entered the kitchen. He looked up, his face pale when he saw her approaching. He knew. She could see it in his eyes. He knew that the game was up. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steady but cold. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the kitchen as if looking for an escape. I'm sorry for what happened earlier. I didn't mean." "Stop," she cut him off. "You knew exactly what you were doing. I'm not here for your apology. I'm here because I know what you've been doing." The color drained from his face. He opened his mouth to say something, but she raised a hand, silencing him. "I know about the audit. I know you're involved in trying to take down my business. I know you've been playing a part in this little scheme, trying to undermine me from within. His eyes widened with shock, but she could see the guilt in them too. He was caught. There was no denying it now. "Why?" she asked, her voice surprisingly calm despite the storm raging inside her. "Why would you do this? I trusted you. I gave you a job, a chance. Why would you try to destroy me?" He looked down at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. "I was scared," he mumbled. "I was scared of what might happen if you found out. I thought if you knew I knew who you really were, you'd get rid of me. I didn't want to lose my job." Her heart hardened. She had expected him to have some sort of remorse, some recognition of the gravity of what he had done, but instead, he was justifying it, playing the victim. "You've been playing a dangerous game," she said quietly. "And now, you've crossed a line you can't come back from." She stepped forward, her presence commanding. "You're fired. You're no longer welcome here. I don't need people like you on my team. You may have tried to break me, but you're the one who's broken." His face crumpled as the reality of the situation hit him. He had hoped for a second chance, for forgiveness, but there was no going back. The silence between them was deafening. She turned on her heel, walking back to her office with her head held high. The waiter's attempt to tear her down had failed. She had seen through the deception, uncovered the truth, and in doing so, had not only saved her business but had reclaimed her strength. She had been tested, broken, humiliated, and betrayed, but in the end, she was still standing. And as for the waiter, he would never have the satisfaction of knowing that she had fallen. The world may have doubted her, but she had proven to herself and everyone around her that no one could ever take her down. Not now. Not ever. The storm had passed, and she had emerged victorious.